I want to welcome Paul Jacob to PAF 494. When voters make their own laws, our survey of global direct democracy. Paul it's really an honor to have Paul in this class. Paul has spent most of his adult life working on direct democracy. He combines he's a big thinker about this process. He's thought very deeply about it. Is a writer, writes about democracy in the country, the column, but also is a practitioner who gets his hands dirty, gets in there, and at the state level and at the local level, has worked with people both to protect this process, to try to improve the process, and to actually use the process in all different kinds of things. We could talk literally for hours, and I think you would keep learning something. But we have about an hour here. I'm delighted to have him here. He's joining us from
Woodbridge, safely
Woodbridge,
outside the Washington Beltway.
Very good. And so just to start, I wanted to start by asking you, how did you first come to this process, to recognize that it was there and to start to participate in it?
Well, it was happenstance. The one part that wasn't happenstance is that politically I would define myself as a libertarian. I got involved in the Arkansas Libertarian Party when I was 16, 17, became state chair and kind of reorganized it when I was 19. And one of the things that libertarians have to do is to petition to get on the ballot. And so libertarians who are serious about politics spend a lot of time collecting signatures. And so I was in a position where I had just run out of money to go to school. And I was working at Taco Bell, which, even though the food is magnificent, was not the greatest job I ever had. Although at the time I remember really appreciating that I got a free meal. And so someone said, hey, they're hiring people to collect signatures. And I jumped at it. And the first day, I think back then, sometimes today, they pay 75 cents a dollar, sometimes $2 or $3 or even $4 or $5 a signature, depending on the crisis that may be swirling around a particular issue. But at the time, I remember I made 50 cents a signature. And I went, the first time I petitioned was at the University of Kentucky for Ed Clark, who ran for president in 1980 as a libertarian. And I remember I collected something on the order of 170 signatures that day. And that was about the best day's pay that I'd received up to that time, maybe still today. Anyway, it was something that I did for months during 1980 and did from time to time after that. And in 1982, I ran my first petition drive to put Rebecca Shipman on the ballot of the Bay State, Massachusetts, for governor. That was 1982, and then began.
So libertarian candidate.
Yes,
I guess.
Yes, was the libertarian candidate, the entire slate of libertarians for statewide office, and so I kind of stumbled into the process, and years later, when Ron Paul, who of course most people know today, ran for president in 2008 and 2012 as a Republican. Well, in 1988. He ran for president as a libertarian, and I ran his ballot drives across the country, and we got on the ballot in 47 states. We made some mistakes, did some things right, but boy, was it a learning experience, and a pretty exhausting learning experience, both mentally and physically. And after that, some folks that I had known before, but had not really been working with, decided that they wanted to get involved in an initiative in Illinois, the Tax Accountability Amendment. We petitioned to put that on the ballot.
Sometimes called the Cutback Amendment, right?
No, that was a different one. That was a successful initiative that cut back the size of the legislature. I've worked on two initiatives in Illinois in my time. The first one was the Tax Accountability Amendment. We collected over 500,000 signatures the courts decided, and I would disagree with this decision, but I think it was somewhat reasonable, or at least not too bad outside the lines. They struck down, said you couldn't use Illinois' initiative process, which is really just a pinhole of a process. Very few things you can do by initiative, and they ruled this was one of the things you couldn't do. They struck it down, so all that work went to naught. Years later, I was back doing term limits. We collected over 500,000 signatures again. So now I have 1 million Illinois signatures under my belt, but never a vote. They struck that one down, and I think they really did swerve outside the lines in striking that from the ballot. But of course, that's one of the things that you find in the initiative process, especially with term limits. After working for the Tax Accountability Amendment, I got involved in term limits, and they saw, I think, my level of petition experience, and term limits was one of those issues where politicians weren't going to do it, but voters would. And so without the initiative process, I mean, forget about it. You're not going to see term limits enacted hardly anywhere. And instead, because of the initiative process, not only the statewide initiative process, which allowed us at one point to have term limited 23 state congressional delegations, nearly half the Congress was serving under term limits when the Supreme Court in 1995, in a case called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, struck down the state limits in my former home state of Arkansas, and in so doing struck down all 23 state term limit laws effectively, and so all that work was for naught, at least at the congressional level. Now, a number of states still have term limits for their state legislature, 15. I believe the number for governor is 36. A lot of states have term limits for their other officers, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, so on. But that was, term limits really opened my eyes to how critical initiative and referendum was, because here was an issue, you know, it's as old as Aristotle and the Greeks and the very beginnings of democracy in the Western world, and something that the founders, like Thomas Jefferson, one of the reasons he said he wouldn't have supported ratifying the Constitution way back when, he pointed out two things: the Bill of Rights, pretty darn important, and mandatory rotation in office. So here was an issue in which huge majorities, 75–80% of the American people across all political ideologies, all races, creeds, genders, and yet we couldn't have it as voters, as citizens, unless we did it ourselves. The people who work for us, who were charged with representing us, on this one said, hey, it's important to me. I want to stay here. I want to be a politician. I'm not going to do what you want. And I think we still have that crisis in politics. It's a lot bigger than just the term limits issue, but that really caused me to see how critical initiative and referendum was, and the ability for citizens to represent themselves. And after working for term limits for a number of years, I started a group called Citizens in Charge. I'm still the
Let's stop there because I want to. There's something I wanted to ask you about term limits before we get to citizens charge, which is, you know, so much of what we're hearing in this class, the students are hearing and reading, is it, you know, from Falun, Sweden to Montevideo to Los Angeles. And this is a process that happens largely at the state level or the local level. But with term limits, you were able to use a state process in all these different states and really almost create, I mean, maybe you would disagree with this characterization, but when you look at it, it seems almost like a national debate and a national, not fully in every state because not every state has it, but a pretty national referendum of sorts over not too many years. How did that occur to you or the people you were working with, and was that healthy? Was that good to do it that way, or was it just a huge headache, a problem? Sort of nationalizing by using these state processes at once. How did you do that? How did you think of it?
Well, I didn't create it. A fellow that I've worked with, who's actually on the board of Citizens in Charge and the foundation, Eric O'Keefe, really came up with the plan, saying, let's put it on the ballot everywhere we can, and let's create I don't know if he said this at the time, but we ended up billing it this way, a national referendum on term limits. And not only was it a national referendum in the sense that you had people voting all over the country, because even in the states that don't have a statewide initiative process, almost all of them, every state except for Wyoming, which does have a statewide process, but every state but Wyoming and Indiana have local initiatives. Some of them, it's a few cities. Others, it's absolutely, pervasive throughout local cities and counties. But we had people all over the country voting on statewide initiatives. In 1992, we put 14 states on the ballot, term limit initiatives in each one. It was the most ever on most state ballots to ever see a single issue in a single cycle. We repeated that in 96, actually, with a slightly different term limit initiative pushing for an amendment. This was after the Supreme Court struck down those states, and again got 14
A
states.
U.S. constitutional
Yes.
amendment. A U.S. constitutional
Yes, and in
amendment,
fact,
to be fair, yes.
a couple of states this last cycle, Colorado, and I can't think of the other state that did it, but they put measures on the ballot instructing state legislators and federal congressmen to support changing the Citizens United decision for campaign finance. So our initiatives were a little bit more robust than what they did, because they actually put language up on the ballot and ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court and being struck down again. But you see people realizing that you can do a tremendous amount by simply getting something on the ballot, because that puts it in the agenda. And one of the things I tell people about the initiative process, it's not just that you can change the law. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and the initiative process is the straightest line in politics. So it's great in that sense. That's why that's the direct indirect democracy. But I also think it's critical to put these issues on the ballot, because it changes the political agenda and it allows the people to get in on the agenda. It's not all established by TV networks in Washington, or the big newspapers, or the Republican or Democratic caucus in the Capitol in D.C. It can be decided by somebody in Dubuque who says, you know what, I don't know whether Dubuque has a process right off the top of my head, but let's hope it does. But you can put something on the ballot in any locality that has this process that might impact the national scene, because these issues tend to, not all, but a lot of issues that are issues at the local level end up being issues at the state and the national level as well. And what comes to mind is a recent issue that kind of didn't happen, the card check, the union idea that would say once people have signed enough cards, there's going to be an election. But it's based
within a workplace,
right?
Yes.
But it wouldn't be a secret
Right.
ballot. And of course, the secret ballot is something that's become kind of quintessential American election process. And I was actually an advisor. Not sure I added a whole lot to the effort, but was involved with some of the people who put these Save Our Secret Ballot initiatives on several state ballots. And I think that it certainly sent a message to folks in Washington that this issue was going to be at the grassroots level. It wasn't going to just be dealt with in Washington. And I think that, you never know, but I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't heard much about card check during the Obama administration.
Well, let's go back to the narrative. So you go through this term limits process, have a lot of victories, and really see the process in all different parts of the country, and then you start Citizens in Charge. Tell us about that and what kind of work that's done.
Well, our original idea behind Citizens in Charge was to focus on getting more states that had the process. People who were supportive of term limits certainly saw the importance in that, because we couldn't get a constitutional amendment through the Congress, but if we could continue to limit state legislatures and governors and statewide officials and local officials, the culture of term limits would hopefully eventually even take over the vaulted imperial city of Washington. So we really wanted to see that expansion. Other people did. I think there are a lot of issues today. The drug war may be in its final days, because some of the measures that have passed around the country, and even in legislatures, you're seeing changes on medical marijuana and so on. I don't think any of that would have happened if they hadn't been able to put medical marijuana measures directly to the voters. So that's the kind of issue that I think has caused people to realize how important this process is. Anyway, we went to Minnesota, where you had Jesse Ventura, independent governor. You had the Democrats in charge of the Senate, Republicans in charge of the House. They had just gotten elected on a pledge the Republicans had in the House to put forward a constitutional amendment for initiative and referendum, and we worked with a group called Let Minnesota Vote and pushed to try to get that done. Unfortunately, we kept getting it through the House. We couldn't get it through the Democratic Senate. And to this day, unfortunately, Minnesota does not have a statewide initiative process, even though they have initiative and referendum in 82 cities throughout the state. So they have it at the local level. And what happened is, as we were fighting in Minnesota and realizing that, in essence, we needed a bigger boat, we needed more money, we needed to fight longer, because one of the difficulties of expanding this process is that it's easier to block something than to get something accomplished. And trying to accomplish something that has the fervent opposition of both big business and big labor, in a country in which big business and big labor are the two biggest boys on the block, it's just extremely difficult. We've polled in every single state at Citizens in Charge, and found that voters, by a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 6-to-1, 8-to-1 margin, like initiative and referendum in every single state, among every demographic group imaginable. And yet it's very, very difficult to get the time of day in any legislature that doesn't have initiative and referendum, because the Chamber of Commerce is going to march in, the teachers unions are going to march in, all the folks who have lobbyists in the Capitol are going to oppose decisions being made by the people. And we ran into that. We also, of course, ran into the fact that in every state that does have the initiative process, every legislative session, about this time of year, my email starts becoming full of people saying, "Oh my goodness, Senator Smith or Representative Jones just proposed an initiative or a bill that would dramatically undercut the initiative process, that would raise the number of signatures, that would put all kinds of restrictions on who could petition, on and on and on." So we really, since about 2004, have been much more geared toward protecting the initiative process where it exists than in expanding it. And we've had some success with that. A lot of attacks on the process in states during the last decade, but a lot of those are being overcome. We last year knocked out, through a lawsuit that the ACLU handled for us, the Nebraska petition law. We have twice struck down the Ohio petition law. We've been working with plaintiffs in.
Let's talk about this, because these students are interested in the details. What did they try to do in Nebraska and Ohio? Are there different categories of kind of attempts to clamp down or restrict the process of what you kind of see?
There are different categories, but really the two biggest restrictions that have been pushed are residency requirements, a requirement that to collect a signature in a certain town or a state, you have to live in that town or that state. And I think there's a level of popularity to that, saying that, well, we don't want outsiders coming into our community and gathering signatures. They shouldn't affect our politics. And that sounds not so bad until you kind of think about, where's that whole idea that outsiders, people who might live in a different city or a different state, can't go to any town in America and speak out, can't go to any town in America and work with someone and help them. If you believe that shouldn't be done, then you believe that the racists in Mississippi were right, and that the Freedom Riders should have minded their own business and gotten out of town. And so we've had a tremendous shift, I think, in the courts. Maybe I shouldn't overstate the shift, but as they've begun to deal with residency requirements, I was involved in a case in Oklahoma, peripherally involved personally, and involved in watching it, where Oklahoma's residency requirement was struck down, and then they appealed it to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and it was struck down unanimously by a 3-judge panel. They struck down residency for Ralph Nader in both Arizona and Ohio. Those went up to the 9th.
Hold on, Paul. Hold on, Paul. In Oklahoma, you were not involved peripherally. They tried to put you and other people involved in the petition drive there. They wanted to send you to prison.
Yes, they did. Yeah, I say they. It was I kind of could say he, the Attorney General, who thankfully is a private citizen these days. But when I said peripherally, I meant peripherally involved in that particular lawsuit against the law. What they did in Oklahoma was to use their residency requirement. I was advising on 2 petitions, one to reform eminent domain takings by public entities and then flipping it to some private developer, and was also involved in a spending and tax cap initiative, Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And we collected the necessary signatures. During the process, we were looking for more petitioners. We had people coming from other states to petition, and the officials with the campaign, both the petition drive and the campaign, spoke to state officials, said, how does this work if someone moves to Oklahoma and wants to take this job? When do they become a resident? How do we make sure we comply with this law? They were told if they get to Oklahoma and declare themselves a resident, they are. And we did a little checking. That's the way it had been dealt with past campaigns. And my personal view, I never know the inside discussions that happen at the AG's office, but it turned out that they challenged this law, or this petition that we had. It didn't become a law because they blocked it from getting on the ballot. But it not only had the opposition, as people might expect, of some of the public employee unions and some of the usual political suspects who would be opposed to cutting spending or to controlling the rate of growth in spending, it also had some very big billionaire donors to Republicans who were opposed to this measure. And so again, you had that big business, big labor opposition to it. They threw out the signatures that were collected by people who had come into the state. In one critical case, someone who had moved to the state to take the job and was still living in the state of Oklahoma a year later, they threw his signatures out saying he wasn't a bona fide resident. Anyway, to make a long story short, they followed up knocking it off the ballot by trying to prosecute myself and 2 others on the charge of conspiracy to defraud the state. The penalty was 10 years in prison, maximum, and a $25,000 fine. Pretty serious situation. But of course, the charges were ridiculous. There was no intent. When you go to state officials and say, hey, is it okay to do this? And they say yes, and then you do it, that's hardly fraud. And of course, I wasn't the one who went to state officials. They came after me because they wanted to go after some of the national people who had helped fund efforts like this and term limits and other things. At least that's my very solid belief. And anyway, again, I was
Let me ask a question about the problems of this kind of residency restriction. I mean, you just made the very principled constitutional freedom case that people should be able to go where they want in the country and work with other people to change the laws. I wonder if I wonder from a practical perspective, a state like Oklahoma, and I think we'll get into time is an issue in a lot of this, which at least then, and I don't know if it still has one of the most restrictive time in the country of just 90 days to a petition. Practically, don't you need to qualify for the process to have any reality, the ability to get things about? You need people who are professional or expert in this to at least be a big part of doing that. It's just too hard to do as a practical matter, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's especially true in a state like Oklahoma, like you say, which has a 90-day period and requires 15% of the vote for governor. And at that time, 15% of the vote for president before we reformed that law. And so it
Wow.
was a huge, we collected 300,000 signatures in Oklahoma. It's not that big a state. That's a very, very tough requirement. We had to do it in 90 days. So of course you want to hire professionals. But even when you have more time, wouldn't you rather hire a professional than someone less professional? If you had a law that said campaign managers or lobbyists or any other, think of any other political position, your ad buyer or your ad guy who makes your TV or radio ad has to live in your city or has to live in your state. It's a little ridiculous. And what impact it has is either denying you enough people to get the job done, or requiring you to pay way more than you would otherwise have to pay. And being someone who goes to donors and says, please, would you help us get thus and so done and get it on the ballot? It's going to cost this much money. I can tell you that they're cost conscious. And if you double the cost of getting something on the ballot, it's harder to sell it to donors. It's harder to get people involved because they don't think it's going to happen. So these things have a tremendous effect on whether ideas get put forward. And as I mentioned before, if I'm putting an idea forward, I want it to win. I want it to become the law. But I think there's a tremendous value in bringing ideas forward, whether they become the law or not, because they inform the debate. They make the public engage on ideas that otherwise they wouldn't have to. For instance, and Citizens in Charge Foundation, we take no position on issues other than the initiative and referendum process. But personally, I look at what's happened with gay marriage. And I happen to believe that if two people of the same sex want to get married, they ought to have the same right as two people of opposite sex. And they'll probably have all the same problems, and let's work together and figure all those things out. But that's my personal belief. It's been a little bit, unsettling to see that I believe there were 32 statewide votes on this issue that all went against gay marriage and banned that. And yet, I think because of those initiatives, the discussion got rolling, and not just rolling among some people, but because we all had to vote on it, or at least in 32 states, that's quite a bit of the country. It was the kind of thing where we were going to be engaging at it in the debate at the water cooler. And that, I think, was critical. And this last November, 4 states either passed gay marriage at the ballot box, or in Minnesota, turned down a same-sex marriage ban. So, the public has changed. And I think that that's a critical part of this process. And so even sometimes when you don't agree with an initiative, you want the ability for people to bring these things up. You don't want political problems to be shunned aside and swept under the rug and to fester. You want the light of day to be there, and you want someone who has a grievance to be able to bring it up and petition their government for a redress of that grievance.
Which is in the Constitution.
My favorite part.
So the other kind of restrictions are restricting. You mentioned it there. Very common times attempted restrictions are just making it harder with more signatures is a fairly common type of restriction. And also we've seen in Oregon, right, changing restrictions on how people are paid, requiring per hour.
Yes.
Pay, which again effectively can make it instead of per signature pay, which tends to be standard, it can make it more expensive to get on the ballot and thus limit access. What out there do you like? I mean, what sort of changes sort of to the process have you seen? I mean, I know I know from looking at the numbers, there's many more restrictions offered in legislation than what might be seen as an opening up. But what sort of things out there, ideas? Again, we're trying to think about specifics in this process. What ideas out there do you see that sort of make a lot of sense from your perspective?
Well, right off the bat, our organization, working with people in Washington State, Tim Eyman, who you know, and folks in that state know more as the anti-tax initiative guru, but Eddie Agazarm and Tim Eyman worked together to put together an initiative called 517, and it is the Protection for Petitioners and Petitioning Act. It does several things. The most important, in my view, is it gives them more time to collect signatures. Right now, they're limited to 6 months. Some states are unlimited. Some states have 2 years or 18 months. We think it should be longer. This particular initiative would give people 6 months more. So to put an initiative on the ballot in Washington, you'd have a year to collect those signatures instead of 6 months. And one of the things we think that will do is to lower the cost. You know, time is money. And if you've got to get something done in a very short period of time, you can't allow volunteers to work at it week after week. You have to come in with the folks who are going to get it done, and that usually means you're paying top dollar. If you have more time, you know, you have some abilities to adjust for that sort of thing. And it also makes it a misdemeanor to harass, intimidate petition signers, petition circulators. There have been all kinds of fairly ugly events that have happened. You know, most petitioning is peaceful, without incident. But in recent years, there have been more and more incidents where opponents of certain measures who realize if it gets on the ballot, it's going to win, have hired people, hired blockers. In fact, years ago when I worked in Oklahoma, I think the opposition had hired as many people to go out on the street and try to harass our petitioners and scream in the faces of people who were trying to sign and
Really?
spill Coke on the petition and shove people and all kinds of things.
Have you experienced that firsthand in your own work qualifying things?
Yes. Yeah. No, it was in 2006 was the first time. We didn't have blockers when I was doing term limit initiatives, but when we were doing the initiatives to control state government spending, we had blockers in almost every state, and the tactics were not, you know, look, if someone comes out and says, hey, I'd like to give you the other side, they have every right to do that. But the tactics they used were to scream at people, to make a scene, to cause any reasonable person to think, gee whiz, I don't want to get involved in a street fight. I just came here for a gallon of milk. And so it's insidious, and it's designed to take away fundamental constitutional rights. It's already against the law in terms of it's a violation of someone's civil rights. But what this initiative in Washington State does is makes it a misdemeanor. And so it makes it easier for local police when you're harassing someone. They don't want to get in a long civil rights, you know, lawsuit, but they can say, look, this person has a right to do this. Under the law, you have to give him space to talk to people. You're free to talk to people, but you're not allowed to intervene. And one of the interesting things, I'll digress for just a second. I ran an effort in Nevada. I was involved in an effort for Taxpayer Bill of Rights there, and they were blocking. And they had done a number of incidents that we had documented. We went to a judge and said, this is a pattern of harassment. It has the potential to become more violent than it already has been. And we asked the judge to slap a temporary restraining order on the opponents using these type of tactics. The judge decided instead she didn't want to do a temporary restraining order. She said to our opposition, why don't you two agree on some simple ground rules? One person will speak to any person that's approaching, either a opponent or a proponent, and we'll have an opportunity to speak until they're finished, and then the other person can speak. We're going to take turns. We're not going to interrupt. We're not going to get within arm's length of each other. We're going to behave. Within about a day, they accepted this because they realized if they didn't accept it, the judge was likely to slap a restraining order on them. And within 24 hours, the blockers were gone because, in essence, they weren't able to be effective by just giving the other side of the story. They were only effective by creating a climate of fear that would cause Americans not to want to engage in political discussions and instead to rush to their car and go home and not be part of political dialogue. So, you know, to me, that was a tremendous educational event. It illuminated that this is not about discussion, that we ought to have every right to oppose any initiative petition, just as someone has a right to propose it. But we do have to control those kind of things. And so this Washington initiative is very effective in that. It also requires that while you can sue to block an initiative from taking effect, in Washington state, you would no longer be able to sue to block an initiative from being voted upon. Now, the state Supreme Court has had a policy for years that they will not allow initiatives to be blocked from the ballot. They won't deal with any challenge until it's actually a law. And then they will address whatever, legal or constitutional shortcomings they might have. But they let the vote happen. And the reason this is so important is at the local level, we've got public officials making deals with red light camera companies that are extremely unpopular with the people. Every time it's put on the ballot, the voters vote against the red light cameras. And so what's happened is that cities are starting to sue to block the voters from even getting to vote on it and rushing to make a contract so that they can block any vote on it. And what will happen if this initiative passes, it won't stop some of the bad behavior, but it means that there's going to be a vote in the light of day that these public officials are going to have to deal with and that everyone's going to know about. And so, again, sunshine is a wonderful and critical part of democracy.
So those are a lot of issues. There was one I wanted to ask you about because it doesn't get very much attention in debates about direct democracy. There hasn't been much work on it, and for students and for scholarship, I'm actually hopeful that maybe some students will take this on as a subject. And we haven't covered in this class to this point. And that's the issue of public space. You need space and places where you can go and approach people. And in my reporting on this subject, and I'd love for you to talk at some length about this, it seems that we have diminished California has this famous Pruneyard decision, which opens malls, at least certain kinds of older malls, to signature gathering and to the conversation of and work of petitioning. But it does seem that I hear from petition circulars, particularly in California, there are fewer and fewer public spaces that are open to them. There's even been litigation against the post office for years, which has tried to prevent the petitions. Could you give us the universe of where it is you can go, and maybe what we should be thinking about in terms of public space in this process to make it impossible for people to approach their fellow citizens in a convenient place?
Yes, I years ago addressed this in a commentary, noting that some people seem to think we have rights, but that we can only exercise those on the moon. And you can imagine if you had a right to free speech, total right to free speech, but you could only use it on the moon, it wouldn't be very valuable. And that's what we're finding with petitioning, is that places to petition are being taken away, and not just private places. As a libertarian, my least favorite part of the Washington State Initiative, I-517, is the part that basically codifies what the courts have already said there, which is that private businesses that have walkways going to their business and public access have to allow petitioning on that public access. Now, I'm fine with that in the sense that we're not making new law. That's what the courts have already said. We're just simply codifying it into the statutes. But what 517 also does that I like is that it requires that public places not only allow petitioning, which you would think they have to, but several years ago in Nebraska, we were doing an initiative, and both the city of Lincoln and the city of Omaha were refusing to allow petitioners on public property. The police were coming and threatening them with arrest. And we ended up having to go to federal court and ended up getting a judgment from the federal court against both of those cities. Now, the people who had to pay that judgment were the taxpayers, who had no role in making that decision. The people who got away with violating our civil rights were the politicians in those two cities. And it's just very offensive that they basically paid off for their unconstitutional actions with the taxpayers' money. But that's the kind of thing that we're seeing. And what 517 would allow is not only would it put in the statutes that you can petition on public property, which of course is already your right, but it would also allow public petitioning inside places like sports stadiums, convention centers, even inside library walkways. Now, you wouldn't be able in the quiet library to go, person to person or through the different rows of books asking for signatures. But when it's freezing cold outside or 110 degrees, let's say in Arizona, and you're collecting signatures, it seems to me that you ought to be able to stay in the air-conditioned inside part of the entrance to the library. Or if you're at a sports stadium and you still have to pay for your ticket, but you could come and be in public areas. That expands the process, and nobody's looking for anything unreasonable. If someone is causes a scene or impedes people's ability to enjoy what they have paid to attend, that's not going to be allowed. But it's the kind of thing where we do need more places for this to work. And there's another angle to this as well, and that is allowing electronic signature gathering. In Utah, the Supreme Court ruled in a candidate case that they had to accept signatures gathered online. And the technology is there to do this. I don't think it would revolutionize signature gathering. It wouldn't make it that much easier, but it would help. And as soon as the Supreme Court there ruled that you had to allow these electronic signatures to count, the legislature just in no time passed a law saying you did not. Because the reason the court ruled that way is because there was nothing prohibiting it. And so immediately they said, no, let's not make it easier for people to do this. We want this to be difficult. In fact, they want it to be impossible. They just can't figure out how to do that without voters realizing what game they're playing. And here's another aspect to that. I read an article just the other day here in Maryland. They're looking at making the referendum process tougher. Maryland has no initiative, but you can take laws that the legislature passes to a vote of the people through a referendum. Usually means you're collecting 100,000 signatures and you put it to a vote. There hasn't been a referendum in Maryland in 20 years. During that 20 years, there were no cries from legislators that, oh my goodness, the people don't have a process whereby they can check our work. But last year, there were 3 different referendums that were on the ballot. All 3, the voters voted to keep the law that the legislature had passed. So they voted on their side. Now we're seeing all these new proposals to make it require more signatures and other restrictions to try to block it. It's the age old that the people who have power want to keep it. And people like democracy when the vote goes their way, but they don't even want to allow the chance that the public might decide to overrule them. One little interesting tidbit to this is that they also referred to some of the signatures that were gathered in Maryland as electronic signatures. And I thought, wait a second, they don't have electronic signatures in Maryland. So I dug into the story a little bit more, and I discovered that what they're calling electronic signatures is the fact that in Maryland, this guy created a website. You could download the petition. You could sign it as a registered voter in Maryland. And then on the little form that says, I circulated this petition, you could sign your own petition saying I circulated it, and you could send it back in. And they were calling it, because you downloaded it from an online website, an electronic signature, and they're wanting to find some way to outlaw it. What they'll probably want to do is require that someone else witness it, which means all of a sudden that it's not going to be very effective, because instead of somebody doing it in the comfort of their own home in 5 minutes, now they've got to find somebody else. And in many states, they require that you notarize those petitions, which makes it almost impossible to direct mail them out to people, makes it almost impossible to put them online and have people, download them and sign them, because now they've got to go to the bank or they've got to go somewhere to get somebody to put their little seal on it. Those things, which are, trust me, inside baseball, they're in the weeds, but they make a big, big difference. And what happens in legislatures is that they constantly are looking for ways like that to add to the cost, to add to the difficulty, to make it impossible to use the democratic means that they pay lip service to. Oh, we have a citizen-controlled government because you have this process, but we're going to try to make it impossible for you to ever use that process. So, I just think this is a great case in point in which the fact that there were 3 referendums is somehow causing people in the legislature in Maryland to run around like chickens with their heads cut off, thinking, how do we stop the voters from having any say-so?
I want to get into a few specific states with some of the time we have left, and most of the students in this class are Arizonans. And I wonder what your assessment is of the process in Arizona. Are there parts of it that you think are pretty strong in its design, parts that you think are weak? What are your thoughts on Arizona?
Well, Arizona has a good process in that they have a constitutional amendment process, they have a statutory process, they have a referendum process, they have recall in Arizona, they have initiative at the local level, which a lot of times gets forgotten about, but a lot of decisions are made at the local level. So it has all the components, which is wonderful. The constitutional amendment process requires 15% of the vote for governor to put something on the ballot. So it's hundreds of thousands of signatures, much, much tougher than it ought to be. I would move it down to about 8%, excuse me, 8% of registered voters for a constitutional amendment. I have a sheet here because I can't remember what their statutes are, but their statute requires 10% to put a statute on. I'd move that down to about 5% or 3%. And make it much easier. They do allow a good bit of time to collect signatures. That's important. So, they get a plus for that. There's another thing that Arizona did years ago, which I happen to really like. You, as I know, as we've discussed, probably don't like it so much. But it is to mirror California's. There were several initiatives that the legislature tried to gut, and in some cases successfully gutted, where the voters vote for something, and then the legislature comes in and says, no, we're throwing that out. And if you do it as a constitutional amendment, of course, they can't throw it out. But if you do it as a statute, they can. And California is somewhat unique in requiring any change to a statute that the voters of California have passed to be sent back to the voters for any change. Now, that may be overkill. But states where they don't have any requirement like that, there's all kinds of problems. We passed term limits in Wyoming, for instance, in 1992. It passed with 77%. That was in November. In January, the state legislature was looking to completely gut that entire initiative. It was a statute. And so you've got those kind of problems. Idaho and Utah, the voters, the legislatures just repealed term limits because they could. In Colorado, they complain, a lot of the people who don't like the initiative complain about the process because it's so easy to do a constitutional amendment, supposedly, and people really should do statutes where the legislature could adjust any bad, provisions or problems that develop. Well, they passed a campaign finance reform measure years ago, and it was gutted. It was a more democratic proposal. It was gutted by a Republican legislature. And even though it won by a huge margin, well, they came right back and they put it in the Constitution, so they couldn't gut it. But those are the kind of things that happen if the legislature has too much say-so. Citizens in Charge, we worked with folks in Missouri on an initiative that was not successful. We ended up deciding not to go forward to collect a couple 100,000 signatures that would have been required. We were blocked in Colorado through a lawsuit. We're still waiting 10 months later, 9 months later, to find out why the Supreme Court ruled against us, but they blocked us from doing a similar initiative. And what these initiatives would do is to require that instead of when the voters pass a statute, the legislature can just gut it at any time they feel like by a simple majority, we require that they do what they ought to do, which is if they have time and it's not a life-threatening emergency, they send it back to the voters and say, hey, we want you to take a second look at this. Or if it is an emergency, the world can't go on, then get a consensus. And we required 3/4 of both houses of the legislature to overrule, repeal, or amend a initiative statute passed by the voters. And again, the best course of action would be for them to send it to the voters. But if circumstances don't allow that, the world's going to come to an end, then at least get a consensus and not a simple majority. And I think that that's important, not only because the voters are the boss, but because also we have a situation, I think, where there's a tremendous disconnect. And you and I think, agree on this. We don't always agree on why, but there's a tremendous disconnect between our legislators, who are supposed to be our representatives, and the people. And I think it's a crisis, because we're heading to some tough times. We've had some tough times, and if there's no trust between the government and the people, you can't solve a lot of problems. And I think the initiative process has sometimes been something that hits back at legislators and that they don't like, and I understand that. And every time the voters vote for something, it doesn't mean that it's right. Maybe the legislators were right. Maybe they were right about term limits. We were wrong. But the legislators work for us, and they have to understand that when the people speak at the ballot box, they're the boss. And so I think we have to adjust these laws, maybe not do what California has done and take them completely out of the hands of the legislature, but certainly require a real consensus before the legislature touches anything that the voters have just voted.
That last is a glorious admission, and I feel like it's progress in your perspective, Paul. I feel like I'm slowly moving you. But
I would quickly just add, I would take California's situation over almost every other state that doesn't block the legislature at all in a New York minute, or maybe an LA minute.
Excellent. That's a fast minute. And I just want to note to students in the discussion notes here, you see I've just put in the Citizens Charge state grades with a link to that. I think you can argue with their perspective, but what you can't argue with, which is the excellence and usefulness of the framework they've constructed that really looks at different aspects of the process and really grades them and really breaks it down in a way I think is incredibly helpful to some of the comparative work you're doing. It's really they've done a great job with those grades, and I hope you'll take a look, particularly as you're thinking about topics, narrowing in on pieces of the process to sort of compare and look and come up with a better way to do it for your papers. To that end, Paul, as we're getting short on time, and thank you for all this time, but the students are trying to look at different aspects of the process, and I wonder if there are, even for someone like you who knows this process so intimately and has thought about it, are there issues, pieces of the process that that you haven't been able to figure out, or where you would like to see more thinking or research about how to improve that? Maybe I don't know whether it's title and summary or post-election review, but anything that you would like to see work on that maybe students could really make a contribution that would be useful.
Well, I think it's funny you mentioned title and summary, because I really think it's one of the diciest areas, because people see when we do polling on a ballot measure, we're going to poll the ballot title. That's what people see when they walk into the voting booth. And one of the classic cases is affirmative action. Now, some people will call them racial and gender preferences. If you poll, you're going to find that in virtually every single jurisdiction in this country, they're going to be against, the majority is going to be against racial and gender preferences. If you change that name to affirmative action, the word affirmative is a pretty affirmative word, action people generally like. If you poll affirmative action, people are for it. Well, you can't be against racial and gender preferences and for affirmative action at the same time, because it's the same thing. And so, how you state something on the ballot is critically important to whether it passes or not. Now, it doesn't decide the issue, but one of the ways I look at it is, if you've got a good ballot title, it could save you millions of dollars in advertising you don't have to do to explain what you're trying to accomplish through your initiative. If you have a bad ballot title, it may cost you extra millions of dollars. And I'm thinking in terms of California. Some states obviously, campaigns run $1 million or under $1 million, but there are campaigns in California where they're spending 40 and 60 and 80 million dollars. So the difference in the ballot title is huge. In some places, my home state of former home state of Arkansas, I think they have one of the best processes throughout the country. But they have one problem, and that is that their ballot title process allows challenges late in the process. So you've collected all your signatures, you've been certified for the ballot. The ballot title might be the title that the Attorney General suggested that you said, sure, let's take that one. What you've written is fine. You go put it on the ballot. It's 6 weeks before Election Day. Someone files suit and says that ballot title isn't accurate enough. The Supreme Court of the state of Arkansas can rule, you're right, it's not accurate enough. Now, what I think should happen in that case is they should rewrite the ballot title to make it accurate. That's not what they do. They take your initiative and they throw it in the trash. Now, that seems to me to be just insane. We fixed through a lobbying effort after the state of Oklahoma decided they didn't want to imprison me anymore. I hung around to lobby some of their legislators, and some great folks in that legislature who were horrified by what their attorney general attempted to do. To be clear, anyway, they changed that. They had a problem where a guy had collected a couple, 200,000 or 300,000 signatures, put an education measure on the ballot, required 65% of the spending to take place in the classroom, had collected all the signatures, and then was sued because a little statement that you have to put on the petition, the gist statement, this is the gist of what this is, they said was not clear enough, wasn't accurate enough, wasn't comprehensive enough. They threw out all his work. This doesn't serve anybody except those who want to kind of keep the status quo and block any democratic activity. What courts ought to do is look at these ballot titles, and California has a problem because I think a lot of times the Attorney General writes a ballot title that's slanted, and then the courts give tremendous deference to the Attorney General. I think that these ballot titles need to be adjudicated. The courts need to look at them and say, if it's not accurate, we will make it accurate. Because anytime that enough citizens sign a petition to put a measure on the ballot, the voters deserve an accurate ballot title, but the people deserve a vote. So get an accurate ballot title and let us vote. I think that's the biggest problem around the country that doesn't get talked about. Some of the restrictions, the paper signature bans, if you wanted someone to pick your apple orchard, you wouldn't want to necessarily pay them by the hour. You might want to pay them by the bushel. Same thing's true in initiative and referendum petitioning. And these laws are pushed by people who want to make the process more expensive. The residency requirements, there's a lot of different things like that that cost money, that block and gum up the works. But the ballot title process from a theoretical standpoint, I think, is the trickiest issue because you want the courts to have a role. It's one of those things where you're afraid of the courts having too much say, but you're afraid of an elected official having too much say.
Right.
And yet how critical it is that the voters get a ballot title that isn't slanted.
But isn't it very true that almost everywhere you have an elected official or elected officials, or some, there's a ballot title board in Ohio, and I mean there's some official doing it. What would you say to the argument that that's an area where maybe there are other ministerial functions that, given research in how people can deliberate and collaborate, given the use of the internet. I mean, we're going to talk later in the class with these Healthy Democracy folks and the Citizens Initiative Review jury process in Oregon. Is there potential do you see, or or does it get too complicated to figure out ways for citizens themselves or groups of citizens to do a ministerial function like that? Why couldn't a jury of citizens try to come up with the title and summaries for initiatives? Wouldn't that make this more of a true citizens process?
Maybe. I think at the end of the day, you want an accurate title. And obviously the process matters, but whoever comes up with the title, it's going to be litigated, or it's likely to be litigated if it's a controversial issue. And it seems to me that just as a public official who does it can not be so independent politically, a title board that's appointed by elected officials sometimes is partisan. even a citizen's jury might become partisan. I think in the end, at the end of the day, it's likely to have to be litigated and a court decide. And I think when they do decide, they ought to look at it, I think as the legal term is de novo, from the beginning without any preconceived notions. And I think that the key thing is that we have a process where people can challenge it, but then the challenge is over, and the hard work that people do to put something on the ballot is not held hostage. I do like the Oregon, healthy democracy idea. I do think we have to be careful that you don't create some gauntlet. I know in Mississippi years ago, they required that there be public hearings in every congressional district. Well, I think in some ways that's helpful, but in many ways it becomes a hassle for the campaign because they got to send people to these public hearings that have 4 people at them. And sometimes the campaigns are run in such a way that the message could reach a lot more people if you didn't have some system that was requiring all kinds of things that aren't really that helpful for the campaign. And I think, how do you handle that? How do you try new things that might provide the public more information without forcing the campaign to jump through all kinds of hurdles? You don't force. You provide a mechanism like they have in Oregon. And I think you can, there are some states that have no voters pamphlet. I'm not usually for spending money, but I think that's probably a good use of resources to put together a voters pamphlet. So any of these things, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. The solution, though, is for who's doing the improving. If legislatures and some of the folks who are in the what I would call the political elite are making the reform proposals, they're all going to make the process harder and more, and people are going to use it less. If the public is engaged in it, we may make mistakes, but generally the process is going to be made more accessible to the average person, and that's what it should be. We're never going to stop powerful interests from being able to use a process that the average person can. The solution then is to make it to where the average person can use it too. And that's around the country, the number one reason for restricting and making the initiative more difficult is to stop special interests from controlling the process. But every single provision that makes it more difficult makes it more accessible on a relative basis for special interest. They raise the bar to where only the special interest can get things on the ballot. So I think I'm excited about your class. I think there's a lot of different things they could look at, from the ballot titles to some of the restrictions on the process. But I think the important thing is that we as citizens begin to look at it and recognize how important a process is that allows anybody who's got a better idea to start talking to their neighbors and ultimately to put that idea on the ballot for the voters and the people to decide.
Do you have 10 more minutes? Can you spare 10 more minutes? Okay.
Sure.
Because we on the legal questions, there are 2 kind of legal questions. You've been so great throughout this, but and on describing some of the legal issues that can arise. And there are 2 areas I want you to address, in part to provide balance. One to another speaker the students have heard from, and another issue to the instructor. The first is, and you mentioned it very briefly, was the issue of review, and when review of an initiative as its constitutionality comes in the process. You said you'd like that process to be at the end. We heard from, or in our hearing in this class, from an assemblyman in California, Mike Gatto, high up in the Democratic leadership, has put in a lot of ideas in on initiative, some of which you've opposed on restrictions, and he argued in favor of pre-review, some sort of mandatory pre-review as a reform, putting quotes, idea that he likes, citing the example of Florida as a place where the courts have been very aggressive in knocking things off the ballot. I'd love to hear succinctly your argument, presumably against that. Why not, take care of these things before people go to the trouble and expense of voting on them? What are your thoughts? And you've worked in Florida, so you may have specific thoughts about how it works there.
Well, Florida is the worst ballot title state in the country. And there was a study that I wish I knew inside and out a little bit more, but it came out last year that was done by Rick Hassan and John Matsusaka.
Scholars in California, one at UC Irvine Law School, one at USC, yes.
And they looked at single subject challenges, for instance, and Florida is big on they allow the proponent to write their own ballot title, which you would think, since I'm a big initiative guy, I'd love that. I don't. I think it's a huge mistake, because when the proponent writes the ballot title, it's almost a given that it's prejudice. Now, they may have gone to all kinds of links to remove their biases and so on, but the presumption is going to be that it's slanted. And so I like having a public official write the ballot title. I just then want it to be adjudicated in a very fair and completely open way. But in Florida, they have ruled all kinds of things are single subjects or are not single subjects. It's hard to tell what they're doing. And they do it ahead of time. You have to go collect 10% of your signatures in Florida to then go to the court and get them to tell you whether it's a constitutional or not constitutional initiative. Part of the problems in Florida are probably not that they do it on the front end, although I think there's a tremendous public benefit to holding a vote when hundreds of thousands, in Florida, you would need 1 million people to sign a petition to put it on the ballot. If 1 million people sign a petition for something, I think we ought to get a vote, even if at the end of the day the court says, no, the way this was done or the particular law involved impedes on federal authority, or whatever the reason is that it might not be able to take full effect. Let the people vote. Let the people have their say. I think that informs the body politic in an absolutely crucial way. But in Florida, I think it's the worst possible way to do it. And if you look, they've done other things in Florida, like require a 60% vote to pass a constitutional amendment, which is the only initiatives they allow. They will not allow statutory initiatives. And then people who don't like the initiative process in Florida have campaigned throughout the state saying, we're getting too many constitutional amendments. They won't provide a means to do anything, but they use that to try to undercut the initiative. So that's not the right way to do it. I think that you want to allow a vote on anything that gets enough signatures to qualify for a vote, and then let the courts deal with it. In the same way, it'd be sort of like, and I suspect that Gatto has not proposed this, and he's proposed a lot. It'd be like saying, let's have a legal challenge to every bill that is brought up in the legislature before it is passed by the legislature or signed by the governor. It just doesn't make sense. Let the process happen and then litigate it. But most of this litigation is designed to give the public less information about what their neighbors and friends and fellow citizens think.
Okay, thank you. That's very well argued and said. The second is an issue I think where we disagree and have disagreed publicly. And it's been litigated.
Are you talking baseball?
No. That you're just plain wrong. But he's a Tigers fan. But it's the questions around privacy for people who sign. There's been a big controversy in Washington State, which we were talking about earlier in Washington State. Now in California, in fact, the signatures on a petition are private. But in most other states, I believe they're public. There was litigation that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where I believe Justice Scalia and the court basically agreed with me and said, suck it up. If you sign a petition, that information, should be public. That's it's a public act of legislating. And Scalia, I think, said people need to be tougher. But what's the problem with that? What's the other side of that argument?
And I just have to say, I don't know how many signatures Justice Scalia has collected in his lifetime, but I like the call for toughness. You know, I think it's a very, very difficult issue, both practically and philosophically, because I think Scalia says something that kind of makes sense. You know, we can't protect everybody from everything. These are public documents. They are people signing a public document, usually in a public place, oftentimes with someone they don't even know who that person is. So the expectation of privacy isn't exactly there. At the same time, I don't think we would, you know, in essence, you're voting. We wouldn't want cameras in the voting booth and people to be harassed and intimidated and called and yelled at and so on after they cast a vote. We really don't want that after they collect a signature. The case at Gallaudet University, the national university, most of the funds come from Congress for hard of hearing and deaf students. They had the chief diversity officer had signed a petition at her church in Maryland for the referendum on gay marriage, and she was removed from her position for signing that petition. Now, how many millions of dollars she and her attorney are going to end up with at the end of this legal effort, I don't know. She was just recently reinstated, and it was all hush hush as to what was happening behind the scenes. But that's, I think, chilling. I think any serious person who believes in
and in Washington State, there were people who
go ahead
signed a referendum to reverse same-sex marriage who were threatened or felt threatened, or there were, you know, their
yes.
homes were, it was put on the internet that, you know, they're identified where they lived exactly. There was some sense of menace or threat. And in California, with fundraising, we don't disclose people, but people who made small dollar donations to Prop 8 got in trouble. The manager of perhaps the worst
right.
Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles lost her job because there were protests against her because she had supported Prop 8. So yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
well, I think the campaign finance, boy, I could discuss that too because I have some strong opinions on that and disclosure and the fact that, you know, years ago the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a case NAACP versus Alabama that the state of Alabama could not force the NAACP to release the names of its members and donors, who no doubt would have been the subject of tremendous threats and intimidation. And I support that ruling, and I think it ought to be there for everybody, not just for some. I don't think the court should pick and choose, you know, who gets to have secrecy and who doesn't. But they have basically done exactly that nationally and in California. But that's kind of a separate point. I think on signing a petition, we actually, as an organization, had a tremendous debate about that. And I expected, you know, we have board members who are on the left and the right and in between. And I expected those who kind of were more on the left to be in favor of disclosure of petition signers, which was how the issue would have broken down in Washington State. And I expected the more conservative or libertarian members of our board to be more on the side of keeping that confidential. It actually was almost reversed. It wasn't 100% reversed, but there was tremendous debate. And so I do think it's a difficult issue. I like the way California does it. I think you want to allow opponents to come in and challenge any signature they want, but I just don't know what public purpose is really served by handing them a disc that has the home address of everybody who signed a petition. And so, you know, as an organization, we lean that way, the way that I'm stating. Maybe I was persuasive, maybe other people were, but I do think that there are two sides to that. And a lot of these issues, you know, when I come to an issue like residency or these restrictions on paying people to collect signatures, I think those are settled issues. The courts, you know, by and large have tended to agree with that. We don't have much discussion on our board. We all tend to see it that way. But on the issue of petition signers being a public document or having a right to privacy, I think we see a lot of room for error, and I think it's easy to see the other side.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for all this time. This has really been beyond terrific and exceeded expectations, and my expectations were high. So thank you so much. I know the students are getting a huge amount out of this, and I can't thank you enough. Please let me return the favor sometime.
Thank you very much, and I'm thrilled that people are taking this class because I think that this process, not a white horse riding into the Oval Office in Washington, but this process at the grassroots is the hope to keep this country free and prosperous, and maybe even make it more so.
Okay. Thank you so much, and